Japan up close.
All right, so this goes back to when I was in high school. I developed an interest in Japanese culture, Japanese history, actually the Far East in general, but Japan in particular. However, just going to Japan wasn't really on the table. Well, Japan is far from Sweden, where I grew up, and it's quite expensive to go to Japan as well. And you have the language barrier and everything. So I kind of I kind of started to enjoy Japan from afar, as in I was watching movies, documentaries about Japan, reading books about Japan, and trying out Japanese food and beverages kind of felt like a natural step afterwards. And my parents actually, they happen to be tea drinkers, both of them. So we drank a lot of black tea, a lot of Indian, Sri Lankan tea. So it felt very natural to me to just try to switch to green tea. So a lot of people confuses us with the tea ceremony masters or tea masters practicing the tea ceremony. What we're doing is actually something quite different. I think the easiest way of explaining it is that we're more like wine specialists or coffee specialists. So a sommelier or a barista, for example. So we have knowledge about tea. We're able to distinguish different qualities and different kinds of teas. And you also have, of course, knowledge about tea history and how to serve tea and about the field in general, how it works. Let's say in short, you're a specialist, but actually a certified tea instructor could do a lot of different things. There are, for example, some people who have the certificate but don't really do it as a main job. Or a full-time job. They would be teaching Japanese children at school how to brew tea, for example. That's one kind of activity. I kind of stand out, I suppose, because I do a lot of media-related work. So I appear in television, introducing different kinds of Japanese tea and how to enjoy them and so on. And I do a lot of events as well. There are some people who are doing similar things as well, but having the certificate is one thing. Then what you choose to do with it is quite another thing. I think definitely the greatest challenge in becoming a Japanese tea instructor is, without doubt, the language barrier. I don't think you could overemphasize the language barrier. If you want to study about black tea or wine or coffee, you can do that in many different languages. However, on this level, information about Japanese tea is only available in Japanese. And I think anyone who's ever tried to study Japanese, you have to remember now that this is not only about speaking Japanese to a certain level. It's not tourist Japanese, but you actually have to be able to read and write. And I think anyone who's ever attempted in studying Japanese knows that it takes quite a lot of years to progress to a certain degree, and especially if you want to take this test. What happens is the first thing you do when you start studying to become a tea instructor is that you get a textbook, or actually 3 textbooks, and it's a total of about 600 pages, and it's all in Japanese, and it's all a lot of specialist terms, and you get a lot of history about tea, and tea originated in China, so you have to read a lot of Chinese history as well in Japanese. That was, of course, the most challenging part, but I'd say that there were a lot of things. I grew up in a city, so I wasn't really familiar with the agricultural part. You have to read a lot about the tea plant as a plant, and how it's grown and cultivated and processed. So it actually covers a lot of fields. I used to be a student of philosophy before I entered the Japanese department back in my university in Sweden. So I'm more into the humanities than natural science, but you had to kind of pick up study that part of tea as well. I think most people could kind of understand the written part, but the thing is, if you're reading about tea processing, for example, and you've never been to a tea factory, or you've only been once or twice, it's actually quite difficult to really understand what it's about. And I think it's probably the same when it comes to winemaking, beer making, or coffee, whatever, that it's so much easier if you've actually seen in this case, the tea estates and the tea factories. And I tried to do this from Sweden at first, because you can do this. This is a distance course, so you can study from wherever you are. You have to come to Japan to take the actual test, but you can start studying the the theory part or the textbook part, wherever you are. But it was just extremely difficult. And I realized after having moved to Japan, having visited some tea farms, that practical experience made it so much easier to actually understand the information in the textbooks. To begin with, I would say that in Japan, or at least until quite recently, tea, well, as in Japanese green tea, has mainly been consumed at home. It's been something that you brew at home with your family. So a lot of Japanese, especially people that are, we'll say, above 50 or so, they're not really used to going to a cafe, order Japanese tea, and pay for it. It's something that you do either at home, or perhaps you even get it for free, like at the end of a meal or something. So they don't really have the culture of, like, paying for a cup of tea or a cup of Japanese tea. It is kind of changing. Last 10, 15 years or so, we got actually a lot more Japanese tea cafes, or so-called Nihoncha cafes, especially in the Tokyo or the greater Tokyo area. So it is kind of changing. And I think the younger generation in Japan is kind of rediscovering Japanese tea, but it is hard to sometimes to actually argue that you should get paid for brewing tea, for talking about tea, for doing tea lectures. And a lot of people that have the same certificate as I do, they do kind of a lot of things kind of voluntarily to, spread Japanese tea. Japanese tea is kind of, suffering from competition from coffee, black tea, and so on. So there is this idea or conception, especially among the elder generations, that we kind of need to work hard to spread Japanese tea. So they would hand out tea for free at different venues and so on, which makes it difficult for a person like me, who I'm kind of basing my business, or my business model is basically trying to get paid for different events and tea fights and so on. So that's one thing that is difficult here in Japan. Another thing that I've noticed is that the Japanese don't really seem to have realized that foreigners, like myself and other people as well, are actually interested in Japanese tea. I think that they have this conception or this view of foreigners as liking only coffee or perhaps black tea, and that the taste of green tea doesn't really appeal to foreign clientele, especially not to Western people. I think that is really changing. Of course, when I started drinking Japanese tea when I was in high school, it's quite a long time ago now. It's almost 20 years ago, but I didn't have many friends that were into green tea, but I think it's changing a lot. A lot of Western people, especially younger people, they've been eating sushi, for example, and different kinds of Japanese food since they were small kids. And I think people are used to, Japanese flavors and Japanese taste nuances like umami and, for example, seaweed and soy sauce and vinegared rice, so on. So I think actually the stage is set. I think we're kind of ready for Japanese tea. And I think the popularity of matcha in countries like the United States and some European countries kind of show that. But the Japanese, and especially the tea industry, is definitely not ready for it. I mean, they are producing tea, obviously. That's one thing that hasn't changed, but you wouldn't find that many people working in the field that are good at English or other foreign languages for that matter. I think that people in the industry kind of just woke up suddenly realizing that, oh, wait a minute, we can actually export Japanese teas. So I think for especially for a Western audience, I think a lot of people are used to matcha these days. And matcha could, of course, be drunk like purely, but it can also be mixed with a lot of things and also added to different sweets. However, in the case of Sencha is brewed tea or steep tea, if you like, and should best be consumed or enjoyed in a pure state. And I would say the beauty of Sencha, or the attraction of that beverage, is that you can brew Sencha in so many different ways. Japanese tea has umami, the rich taste to it, a rich taste to it, and it also has this dryness or astringency, slight bitterness, and also some slight sweetness. But you can alter all these flavor or taste elements by adjusting different parameters when you brew tea, like temperature, the amount of water, the amount of leaves, and so on. And you can do this to an extent that you can't really do with, for example, oolong tea or black tea. So you can play around a lot with your sencha. If you're a fan of a green tea that has sort of a punch of bitterness, you can actually use quite hot water. However, if you want your tea to be sweeter, you can make sure that you're cooling down the water before brewing, and so on. There are a lot of different things. Now, I'm writing about this in my books as well, how to prepare Japanese tea, and it's actually my books are available now both in English and also in French. If we happen to have any French speakers watching this video, so I do write a lot about how to brew tea and enjoy tea, and I think that's the beauty of tea. It's got a lot of variation actually. So we've seen a couple of years now with an increasing popularity of matcha, and I'm kind of hoping that Sencha, which happens to be my favorite beverage, the reason for me coming to Japan, I wanted to become a specialist, a Japanese tea specialist, specializing in Sencha. So I'm kind of hoping that Sencha will be the next, well, if not the next big thing, at least the next thing that consumers or tea drinkers overseas are going to take on. Well, that's their next thing to try. And when that happens, I would like to be the person or one of the people who could provide really curious tea drinkers and tea lovers out there with the best kind of teas. And when I say best teas, what I'm looking for in a good tea is a tea that doesn't just only taste good when you're actually drinking it, but should have a taste that lingers for quite a long while. And you should also be able to tell the differences depending on the type of tea plant cultivar used and the different kind of areas. So I'm specializing in single origin or single estate Japanese tea. So basically the idea is that if you can't get enough of Sencha, if you can't get enough green tea, and you really want to try the most unique taste experiences, well, Senchaism is the place to go, or the brand to turn to. So I do have an online store. If you type Senchaism on Google, I think it's gonna be one of the first hits. But you can also access it through my social media accounts, my personal social media accounts, or my official website. So type either Senchaism or Oscar Brekell, and you'll find your way.
Japan up close.